Hi, this is a video guiding you through the two language check texts in the anthology booklet that you've got, texts 21 and 22, what I generally refer to as the Bridewell Hospital texts. So I'm going to start by reading this first one to you, but I would like it, please, if you would, before you listen to that, to pause my recording and do what we've said before, which is to see what you can do on your own without me helping you. Okay, so that generally involves reading through this text all the way through, this first one, okay, having looked at the blurb at the top very carefully to see what you can make of it, and then maybe even read that 2 or 3 times, and so that you really get hold of it, and then read the blurb at the top of the second text and read the second text. The second text is usually easier to get your head round because it's more modern. Not always, but usually. And then come back to this older text and read it again. As we've been saying all along, you need to be thinking straight away about some of the frameworks that we like to look at. Yes, frameworks, we can call them levels, we can call them methods. Those ones that we've talked about on a number of occasions. See if you can actually do that yourself. See if you can remember what those levels are. Yes, those ways in. And remember that we don't have to always just work formulaically through them. We can try different, maybe more theoretical approaches. I'm deliberately not listing them for you. I will list them for you in a little while because it will be handy to have them, won't it? Okay, so pause the video now. Have a read of these texts. You should take probably about 10 minutes over it. See if you can get all the way up to the point where you can actually imagine writing about it. Okay? I will come back to you, or I will obviously be picking this up as soon as you press play again. Alright, well now I'm going to start by reading this text aloud and see if I can get it off the page in a way maybe that you are unable to. Remember, that is just a case of getting used to this funny old-fashioned syntax that we've got with these kinds of texts. So text C is an extract from a committee's report published in 1799 on Bridewell Hospital, listing different ways in which the hospital should use its resources locally. So do look at the blurb and look at it carefully, right? It says a committee's report. What is a report? Yes? Are you familiar with different types of report? For example, are you familiar with, say, something like an Ofsted report? Yes? And you may know that there are all sorts of different types of bodies out there, even now, in fact more so now, probably than in 1799. It's a very old text, this, that look at all sorts of bodies these days. You know, look at institutions, look at the health service, look at particularly public institutions to see if, I suppose, the taxpayer's getting value for money. But back in 1799, you've got to always say to yourself, well, hang on, how well developed was this genre of text, which I kind of now may be aware of? Yeah? Does that make sense? So think about reports now, and think about what reports might have been then. Now this is complicated because actually, grammatically, it ought to really have helped you a bit and said something like, we have found, yes, ... because that's what the people inspecting it would somewhere in the report have written. We have found, and then off they go into this list. And of course, you know, don't you? I mean, I'm thinking about this in modern context, and I've read a lot of Ofsted reports over the years. I would expect to see in this day and age all in bullet points, but it isn't here, is it? We have found, imagine that your committee is of the opinion that a judicious and economical use of Bridewell Hospital and its estates, according to the intentions of the royal founder, would have a very great effect in the diminution of vice and misery and in the increase of industry and habits of good life within the metropolis, and that the persons particularly and specifically marked out as the objects of the trusts created by the founder of Bridewell are, at the present time, in the greatest want of it, to the great increase of beggary and distress, and to the disgrace and detriment of the community, viz., idle, uneducated youth of both sexes who are advancing to maturity and are becoming profligate and vicious for want of character or occupation, convalescents from hospitals who require gentle employment and nourishing food to recover entirely their health and strength and the means and power of labour, and discharged prisoners, and other persons who, not having character or the means of honest employment, are frequently reduced to the dreadful alternative either to steal or to starve. That, in order to diminish the number of beggars and of idle and dissolute persons, as well as to reform beggary, it is the opinion of your committee that some general plan or provision for work should be adopted and encouraged within the walls of this hospital, where, with the willing poor, may more usefully to themselves and to the public be employed than they are at present, and whereby the froward, strong and sturdy vagabond may be induced to live with increased comfort to himself and with increased profit to the commonwealth. That your committee is of opinion that with economical management, particularly in the articles of clothing and food, a small revenue may be sufficient for great and extensive purposes, that by a marked distinction between the industrious and the idle, and between the vicious and the well-disposed, and by affording countenance and favour to those who endeavour to do well, reform may be effected, that, by example, by encouragement, and by holding forth the prospect of an improved condition of life, the energy and the industry of man may be awakened and brought into action in any situation and under any circumstances. And lastly, that by disinterested kindness and attention, the affection, the confidence, and the implicit reliance of the poor may be obtained. All right, so I will work through this text with you just to get it off the page, because I think that's basically what I want, because I want to be able to work on these texts in various different ways, and so this is handy for me. So it begins like this: that your committee is of the opinion that judicious and economical use of Bridewell Hospital. This suggests that presumably the hospital is not being used, right? So it's not currently being used for the right things. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at a text like this and I think to myself, hang on, hospitals are not surely in this day and age, are they, expected to do all this stuff? But it looks like they were. And of course, hospitals that we think of as now, with emergency departments and with, radiography departments and maternity and obstetrics and so on, there just wouldn't have been anything like that back in 1799. When you consider how backward medicine was at that time. I mean, I don't know if they were still bleeding people and, using all sorts of kind of stuff that is not that dissimilar to kind of trying to use witchcraft really in 1799, but it wasn't anything like it is now, and they were just probably fairly hideous places. But more than that, I think what's so interesting here is the fact that clearly a hospital here is being just sort of being expected to do everything. And what is it expected to do? Well, what they want, it seems, the Bridewell Hospital to do is they want a diminution of vice. Now, you might look at a word like diminution and not have a clue what to do with it. Diminution. Maybe, though, you might know the word diminutive. you would certainly know the word minute, yes? So it's basically reduction. It's an old or probably Latinate word for reduction. So would have a very great reduction in the reduction of vice and misery, and in the increase, anything interesting there, of industry and habits of good life. Now, industry, what do we think of as industry now? What does industry mean there in the past? And just think about that. Industry. Yeah, industry. Have you heard of the adjective industrious? Does that help you with what it would mean here? We're not talking about making steel or cars or anything, right? And the habits of good life within the metropolis, which is obviously a kind of fancy word for city, right? And that the persons, interesting, and that the persons, particularly and specifically marked out as the objects of the trusts created by the founder, the objects of the trust. So, they are the people to whom the trusts, presumably it's a big ton of money, like a kind of charity type thing, the trust's money was aimed towards, are at the present time in the greatest want of it. Now, we use want in a different way, I think, now to what it's being used there. What does want mean, do you think, in this context? The greatest want of it, the want of something. It's not being used as a verb, is it? So you see if you can work that out. To the great increase of beggary and distress. So as a result, at the moment, not only do these persons want an increase of industry and habits of a good life, but the problem with not having it, with the want of it and the want of the hospital's help, we've got a great increase, it's saying, of beggary and distress. Beggary just means what it does now. And to the disgrace and detriment, which is detriment basically is kind of like poor reputation, I suppose. Poor reputation of the community. Viz, now that would be a Latin term. I don't know what that is, literally translated, but it's essentially, it's like, in other words, that type of thing, really. You might want to look that one up. Idle, uneducated youth. This is what's going on at the moment. Idle, uneducated youth of both sexes who are advancing to maturity, right? They're growing up and are becoming profligate. Profligate means, you can see I've cheated here. I've looked it up. It means a lot of different things. I don't think in this case it means wasteful, however. Profligate consumers of energy. I think it's more likely to mean this dissolute, which of course you also probably don't know what it means, but you would know what the word corrupt meant. So a dissolute person is basically someone whose morals are kind of shot to bits. All right. So they're worried that these young people are becoming profligate and vicious. Does vicious mean now what it meant then? I'm not sure. For want, there's it there again, for want. What does want mean? Yes, see if you can. Have you, by this stage, worked that out? Of character or occasion. No, look for this word character. It keeps cropping up. Character, it's not character like character in a novel, is it? What kind of character is it? Again, you can look that up if you want. Convalescence is a term we still use now. If you're convalescing, you're kind of recovering from an illness. Convalescents from hospitals who require gentle employment and nourishing food to recover entirely their health and strength and the means and power of labour. And discharged prisoners. Yeah, prisoners who've left prison. And other persons who are not having character, there it is again, or the means of honest employment are frequently reduced to the dreadful alternative. Now, I have no idea whether that's just a misspelling of dreadful or what, or whether it's an old-fashioned word. Either to steal or to starve. That, in order to diminish the number of beggars and of idle, dissolute person. Dissolute, I think, is actually no longer used. I'm going to look that one up as well. I've looked it up and I think it is a misspelling of dissolute. And a dissolute, again, is people whose morals are kind of shot. As well as to reform beggary. So they want to diminish the number of beggars and they want to reform beggary. And it is the opinion of your committee that some general plan or provision of work should be adopted and encouraged within the walls of this hospital, where the willing poor may more usefully to themselves and to the public be employed than they are at present, and whereby the forward Strong and sturdy vagabond. This is a great word, vagabond. A vagabond is basically somebody who is kind of, well, we use this term homeless now, don't we? But someone who's kind of like deliberately without a home. We might use the word traveller now, and of course, again, traveller, as you know, in some settings, completely unjustifiably, and you may be listening to this and yourself be in some way related to somebody from the travelling community, so I don't mean it to be pejorative at all, but there's no question that the idea of being a traveller does sometimes get negative press, unjustifiably. The word vagabond is essentially that kind of thing. It's somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't actually have a place to live. Yeah, and of course now we have all sorts of associations with this, which are going to be of use to you when you think about these two texts. Maybe induced to live with increased comfort to himself, with increased profit to the commonwealth. So the commonwealth. Now, you may have heard of commonwealth in relation to ex-colonies. Yes, we talk about the Commonwealth, which is places like India and places like places in Africa and so on, sort of gradually breaking up now. Really, the Queen is the head of state of these places, but the Commonwealth here, yes, it's been separated. So I'm not going to say what's going on there, but maybe you can work something out. That your committee is of opinion that with economical management, particularly in the articles of clothing and food, a small revenue may be sufficient for great and extensive purposes. So it all can be done, coming back again to it's up the top there, this idea of it being, it can be done economically, this. And it can go a long way, basically. That by a marked distinction between the industrious and the idle, and between the vicious and the well-disposed. So in other words, if you can work out who's industrious and who's idle, and by affording countenance and favour to those who endeavour to do well. So obviously you're always going to give it to the people who deserve it. This is what we now think of quite a lot as the deserving poor. Bizarrely enough, is still sort of in people's consciousness now, 200 odd years on. Reform may be affected there, basically means it may be kind of carried out. That by example, by encouragement, by holding forth the prospect of improved condition of life, the energy and the industry of man, maybe that's man, in that generic sense, may be awakened and brought into action in any situation and under any circumstances. And lastly, that by disinterested kindness, now, you might want to look that one up. I'm not going to tell you, but it's a great one to look at. Disinterested is not the same as uninterested, okay? And people in the modern era get very steamed up about that. So if you were to see that word anywhere in one of the texts, it'd be great for you. Could have great fun with it. Attention, affection, confidence, implicit reliance of the poor may be attained. So the implicit reliance, i.e. I think we're talking there the kind of self-reliance or the gratitude of the poor or whatever. I think going back, we have found was probably the wrong thing to put at the front, but you get the idea. Maybe something like this would be better. It is here stated. Something pompous like that, probably. It is here stated that your committee is of the opinion that, and then off they go. Right, this is the modern text. Much, much easier to get your head around. Now, George Orwell actually spent time as a beggar. And he did it in London and he did it in Paris, and in fact it made him very ill. He did it in order that he could actually get an experience, a genuine experience of what life was like. Now you may know George Orwell, do you? Have you heard of 1984? Have you heard of Animal Farm? He was a really interesting figure. He was a socialist, okay? He was a novelist. Socialist as in he believed in socialism, which is sort of sharing out things within society more fairly and believing absolutely that society is the way to do that, as opposed to capitalism in its rawest sense, which kind of reckons that you should just get on with it, basically, get out of the way of people and things will sort themselves out to a degree, with some regulation and various other things if you are a kind of, if you believe in a reformed form of capitalism. Communism, however, he didn't really like, and because he saw in his own lifetime, this is actually sort of coming up to that era, 1933, but not quite there yet. He must have seen some of it happening in Russia. Communism, as you know, which is full of idealism and the idea that you can share everything out equally, tends to go wrong when it's actually brought about, because what happens is power gets involved. Power gets concentrated in a very small portion of the country. So we're talking about Stalin, we're talking about Hitler to a degree, although he wasn't a communist, and in fact he rounded up the communists. But that kind of let's talk Stalin. Let's talk. I mean, if you're thinking now, you could talk about China actually, which is absolutely ruled in a completely restrictive way in terms of liberty. So he doesn't like the way beggars are treated. Okay, but he was a beggar, and so he took that role. So that's absolutely vital to these texts. You go completely astray if you start thinking he himself is attacking beggars. He is not. Okay. It is worth saying something about the social position of beggars, for when one has consorted with them, consorted, i.e. kind of lived with, hung out with, you'd probably use now, yeah, and found that they are ordinary human beings, one cannot help being struck by the curious attitude that society takes towards them. People seem to feel that there is some essential difference between beggars and ordinary working men. Again, you might want to comment on this gender aspect. They are a race apart, outcasts like criminals and prostitutes. Working men work, beggars do not work. They are parasites, worthless in their very nature. So this is, in a sense, all of this really is in inverted commas, this bit. It's not him saying it. This is an attitude that he sees around him. Okay, if you mistake that through not reading carefully with this pair of texts, and there will always be an example of that, you risk undercutting the value of what you then go on and say. It's taken for granted that a beggar does not earn his living as a bricklayer or a literary critic earns his. He is a mere social excrescence, like kind of, oh my God, would be an excrescence would be like, I suppose like a boil, yes, like a ghastly growth to be removed. A mere social excrescence, tolerated because we live in a humane age, but essentially despicable as in to be despised. Yet if one looks closely, one sees that there is no essential difference between a beggar's livelihood and that of numberless respectable people. Beggars do not work, it is said, but then what is work? A navvy, so this is like a road worker, yes? Think of it like that, or somebody building canals, that type of thing. Works by swinging a pick. An accountant works by adding up figures. A beggar works by standing out of doors in all weathers and getting varicose veins, chronic bronchitis, etc. It is a trade like any other. Quite useless, of course, but then many reputable trades are quite useless. I'm thinking about in our modern era, I mean, this is 1933, but, what about people who sell cigarettes? Would we say that is a useful thing in society? What about, certain types of beauty product? Maybe you think all beauty products are worth having. I don't know. But anyway, what about merchant bankers? What about the unelected members of the House of Lords? I don't know what your political position is. These sorts of things, they're reputable, they're up the top of society, but are they actually useful to society is kind of what he's saying. So this is his kind of socialist side coming out. And as a social type, a beggar compares well with scores of others. He is honest compared with the sellers of most patent medicines, high-minded, so patent medicines like pills, etc. High-minded compared with a Sunday newspaper proprietor, so he's really doing over the people, of his era, people like Lord Beaverbrook, I think. But if you think now, someone like Rupert Murdoch, this is 1933, so Rupert Murdoch wouldn't even been born, but you get the idea. It's that sort of figure he is pulling down. Amiable compared with a higher purchase tout. And we still have hire purchase. When you buy cars and stuff, partly you kind of buy them on a sort of everlasting loan. Well, those loans were sold, or have been sold, by quite kind of dodgy people over time. And once you're in it, you're kind of a bit stuck in it. And you may know of people who've been in this sort of situation. You have to constantly pay off the interest, and you never even own the blinking car. So that wasn't any different in 1933 than it is now. In short, a parasite, but a fairly harmless parasite. He seldom extracts more than a bare living from the community, and what should justify him according to our ethical ideas, he pays for it over and over in suffering. I do not think there is anything about a beggar that sets him in a different class from other people, or gives most modern men the right to despise him. Then the question arises, why are beggars despised? For they are despised universally. I believe it is for the simple reason that they fail to earn a decent living. In practice, nobody cares whether work is useful or useless, productive or parasitic. The sole thing demanded is that it shall be profitable. In all the modern talk about energy, efficiency, social services, and the social service and the rest of it, what meaning is there except get money, get it legally, and get a lot of it? Money has become the grand test of virtue. So this may seem to you to be really odd, but essentially what he's saying here, this is his kind of socialism coming out. It is a sort of anti-capitalist kind of viewpoint, really, which is looking, capitalist. Sorry, you get that as a lie there. Anti-capitalist view, but essentially this idea that everybody is kind of motivated by money. In 1933, wow, are they now? I think a lot of them are still, yes. Really, work is whatever you want it. Work is going out to get money. That's what it is. And if he's saying you simply earned enough money from whatever you do, you will be respected. And we know this, don't we? So why, for example, if you said to your parents, oh, I want to go off and earn a ton of money in the City of London, they might actually be a lot more excited about that than if you said you wanted to go and be a social worker, right? Why? I mean, social work is patently better for more people, isn't it? I mean, maybe you could argue against that, but I think you'd be hard pushed. And I think it's the reason is that particularly in some households, it's seen as kind of good in a way to earn money. It's sort of virtuous. Nothing much has changed on that. By this test, beggars fail, and for this they are despised. Notice this kind of word being despised, despicable, is again and again and again repeated, so you could do some work with that, couldn't you? If one could earn even £10 a week at begging, it would become a respectable profession immediately. And £10, by the way, in 1933 would be quite a lot. That would be a good-ish living, okay, in the period. I mean, not massive, but a decent sum. A beggar, looked at realistically, is simply a businessman getting his living like other businessmen in the way that comes to hand. He has not, more than most modern people, sold his honour. He has merely made the mistake of choosing a trade for which It is impossible to grow rich. And there is something implicit in all of this, really, I think, which is that he is criticising the whole system, isn't he? I mean, he's on the side of the beggar, but he's really talking about the entire system that has beggary in it and accepts it in the first place, that it's just even there. So there's a kind of, I see this as sort of ironic, really. I don't know how you are with irony. Irony basically means you read one level, yes, of text, but you understand one below. So you're reading about this sort of idea that beggars, if they earned more money, would be better respected. But really what you're understanding by it is that society's values are all up the creek. Yeah? All right. So I've spent half an hour on that. I know that's a long time, but hopefully it will help you. And at this point, obviously you're doing all this in theory in about 10-15 minutes in your head. Yeah. And that's tough to do, I accept. But again, that's why I keep saying practice. And I'll be, I'm talking about that a lot, aren't I? So you need to have in your head all of these things. So yeah, you need to be able to quickly either jot them down or just have them in your head. Lexis, semantics, discourse structure. Yes. The lot of stuff that we've been doing on grammar. And that really is syntax. Yes. It is sentence types. So you can fit in anything rhetorical into grammar, and that can be really useful. Things about mood can be really useful, like imperative, declarative, interrogative. Yes. And what else? What else? Can you think of any others? What else have we not talked about? You could possibly, with these two texts, you could have a bit of a go with orthography if you wanted to. But we're all the time, we are looking for change, aren't we? And we're thinking about attitudes to the topic, in this case, beggars, etc. Not just beggars, but and then attitudes to language, which are not on the surface, are they? Nobody's talking in either of these texts about language. So you have to kind of work out what the attitudes are based on the way the things are written. So the sort of expectations, if you like, of what's going on underneath the surface of the text, if that makes sense. All right. So, off you would then go, you could do it. And I can't remember, the color scheme that was last used, but you could get your coloured pens out now. And I've talked to you before about various things. Do you remember I talked to you about beginnings? Well, okay, I don't think beginnings would work so well with this because there's no newspaper article, so that we might have to ditch that one. They can be really useful. I do think, however, that power might work. I definitely think power could work. I definitely think gender could work. I think technology will not work. There's just no point in it. So, standardization, all those kinds of things, yes. Yes, definitely could be fitted in, as could prescriptivism, as could descriptivism, all of that sort of stuff, and anything else that you can think of in the theoretical area. You could bring in our friend Haugen. You might look at 1799, might you, and think 1799, well, 1755 was the dictionary. Yeah, Johnson's dictionary. 1762 was Louth's thing on, do you remember that? On his grammar book, and so on. Has the standard been implemented by the time this text is being written? So some orthographical things there. You can see capitals still appearing, but they don't seem to appear on the same rules that we've had before. Character, occupation, these are nouns, but profligate is a verb. Why are verbs and are all I don't think we can say all nouns are being capitalised, are they? Absolutely not. So, sorry, I've just got to type that in. So, get rid of that. Go. So we need to think now about what else, how we're going to actually approach this. Well, I would say for all of these things, lexis and semantics are an absolute kind of solid thing, because you can always talk about words relating to the theme that's being presented to you. You know, I mean, I'm looking at text D here, but you know, what are beggars being called here? Well, when he's talking about them being seen as bad by others, not by him, they are outcasts, criminals, prostitutes. They are an excrescence, which I've told is like a sort of horrible growth that needs to be cut out or removed. They are. And then we have lots and lots of different types of things here. But here, he then changes. Look, a beggar looked at realistically is simply a businessman, getting his living like other businessmen. I think you could have some quite good fun with that. And then you'd go back to text C and look at the ways in which these people, these outcasts, are being represented. Yeah. Well, we've got beggars all over the place, but there's all sorts of other things in here too, some good ones and some bad ones. So we've got convalescents, but we've also got vagabond. You know, I think I would probably do some work on vagabond, because I think it would be a really interesting and fun one to discuss. We find that we've got prisoners, so you might look at the semantic field there, perhaps, could you? Yeah, and so on. And that's where a plan comes in, please, folks, and what I would like you to do next. So, semantics and lexis are a kind of joint thing, and there's loads you could do with them, I think. So you might start with, for example, names. And we've said before, this is, you know, names and epithets. So on the one side, we can have vagabond. On the other side, we can have outcast, parasite, but also then businessman. Surely you could look at the the connotations of some of those words. And suddenly we've got a section ready to go. Another section that I think would work very nicely would be to look at register and formality. Again, this is a pretty reliable one that you can use quite a lot. You can see the formality level of this one is pretty well, it's very carefully presented, isn't it, for its audience. I mean, just the fact that the lengths of the multi-clausal sentences and so on, but also the choice of lexis with judicious, economical, and so on. That some of these very carefully chosen words like disinterested, which I think, as I say, I would discuss, and so on. When we go to Orwell, but by the way, I do think it's interesting that here is a rule that we're not meant to break, are we? That you start a sentence with and. Is it simply the case then that you just can start a sentence with and back in 1799? And does that then mean that the kind of imprint of prescriptivism is strong in some areas but not in others? Some rules hadn't even been formed. I think Orwell still maintains a fairly he does maintain a fairly controlled and standard form of English, doesn't he? You notice there are no abbreviations anywhere. But what are there? Well, you've got some sort of spoken elements. You know, why are beggars despised? ? Is essentially in there in order to kind of wake you up, and you could use that when you were talking about rhetoric, maybe, if you want to do that elsewhere. Is there except get money, get it legally, get a lot of it? So this bit in quote marks I think is really useful. because you can talk about a sort of mixed mode, can't you, at this point? Don't you think? What could you say about it? But nonetheless, there is a sort of quite a high level of formality in this one as well. It's just easier to read, I think, because he has decided to go for lots and lots of very simple expressions, simple sentences. An accountant works by adding up figures, a navvy works by swinging a pick. And on that point, I think I might be tempted, so let's suppose I've done register there, go straight on into maybe something like grammar. Do you think? Would grammar work? And grammar is something that I think would be easy to write about in both these texts. Absolutely do. I think it's kind of, I'm talking about syntax here. So, I go back again to text D, and you look at the way in which he manages the sentence lengths. A navvy works by swinging a pick. An accountant works by adding up figures. A beggar works by standing out of doors in all weathers and getting varicose veins, chronic bronchitis, etc. I would definitely talk about that. So you've got 1, 2, 3 simple sentences up to the point of figures, and then this last one, but works by. Then are they simple sentences? They're not. Sorry. A navvy works by swinging a pick. So swinging a pick is a is a subordinate or dependent clause, but it's not a complete one. We'd call it a non-finite dependent clause. But you get the point. Each one is structured the same way. A navvy works by swinging a pick, adverbial at the end there. An accountant works by adding up figures. So we could talk there about the sort of parallel phrasing, couldn't we, of these shortish sentences. If you don't know whether it's a simple, compound or complex sentence, find another way to say it. Why is he doing it there? I think, get deep into that. That's a good one, I think, to look at. Going back to text C, meanwhile, when you're looking at the grammar, well, the obvious thing is the enormous length of the clauses, of the sentences, and the multi-clausal nature of them is quite interesting, I think. But you have got some really interesting patterns going on here, and we might pick this up in another part of the lesson or another lesson. But look at the uses here, for example, of these: who are advancing to maturity, who require gentle employment, and who not having character. Do you remember what those are called? They've got a specific name, those types of clauses, and they're being used each time for a particular thing as this massive, great sentence goes along. Could be just one example of one that you could look at in some depth. That's pretty much exactly what I wanted to do in this session, folks, in this online bit. That's nearly coming up 45 minutes of time, and you hopefully have also spent 10 minutes reading and preparing as well. So it's quite a big old thing I've asked you to do there. I hope it's been useful. I hope you've come out with a plan of some kind. Why not go on and have a go at trying to write it? Okay, that's all for now, and we'll see you on the other side, as it were.